So I've got the easiest job of the evening. Many of you know me, I'm Andy Tanger, I'm the town moderator. And since this is not really, it doesn't appear to be an unruly bunch, it should be pretty smooth sailing. Apparently, we're looking to have really two parts, questions on and clarifications on the actual presentation that's going to be given. If you do have questions, it would be nice if you could hold them. And if you raise your hand, Jim Corvin there will be keeping an eagle eye on the group, and he'll come over and give you an index card that you can jot your question down. I think you're on your own for a pen, unless Jim has a pocket full of that.
There's some pens at the front of the table over there.
Pens at the front. So then, once we're done with the presentation, then in theory, the second part of that would be just open discussion for whatever you'd like to discuss about with conservation, how the state is developed, whatever you guys want to have thrown at you.
Okay.
And I'll keep an eye and call on you. What we're hoping, I don't know that there's anything that's going to be considerably fractious in this. I'd ask you to address any comments to me rather than anything that is an ad hominem attack or whatever on the person who is making a comment or an observation. So we need to have things kept civil because we are all neighbors. And again, address them to me, and they'll hear what you say. They'll answer it then. And raise your hand if you want Jim to give you a card. And I guess with that, off we go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
This is great. Hi, everybody. So glad to be here. I'm trying to figure out where to stand so I don't block the screen. As was mentioned, my name is Stacy Sabula. I'm the Associate Conservation Director at VHCB, Vermont Housing Conservation Board. And just curious, by show of hands, who's heard of VHCB before? All right, that's good. We like that. So yeah, we're really excited to be here today, and I have to give a big shout out to Jim and the other members of the MCHT board. They did an amazing job promoting this event, organizing it. So could we give a round of applause to them? Honestly, this is one of the larger groups that we've had, and I'll talk more about this in the presentation, but we've been doing kind of this little road show for about 2 years on and off during different parts of the process. So we've gotten a ton of public input, which has been really interesting and informative, and we've had groups anywhere from like 5 or 10 people in a room to like 50 people, but this is awesome to see this turn out tonight, so glad to be here. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be essentially giving a bit of an overview about the work that we and other groups have been doing on this Vermont Conservation Plan, which is the Phase 2 part of the Act 59 work. So we're just giving some background information on that whole process. And then, as you said, Andy, like this is very much a conversation. Like we don't want to be talking at you. We want to hear from you on comments.
I'm going to interject something. This is a conversation that people are paying a great deal of attention to. There's a camera back there, and I guess you're with
Okemo Valley TV.
Right, with our Okemo Valley Television for public access. So by definition, you're going to be recorded. And if that wasn't enough, we have the members of the Conservation Trust that are going to be making a report on the evening, and they will be taking notes as well. So everybody's got an eye on you.
But we hope that won't stymie people from speaking on. Thank you for that heads up. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Okay, because without a mic, I hope I don't get lost in the room here. Okay, so we'll start things off. I'm going to talk for a little bit and then turn it over to Bill. Okay, so who we are and what we do. So VHCB is a quasi-public organization, meaning that we sort of sit outside of state government. We're not an official state agency, and we're a little bit like kind of a cross between a nonprofit and a state agency. So we get funding support from the legislature, but we have our own independent board of directors, and we've been around for almost 40 years. Next year we'll celebrate our 40th anniversary. And really our mission, as our name suggests, is really focused on both affordable housing and land conservation. So the VHCB was formed back in the late 80s, like time that was pretty similar to where we are now, where there was a lot of concern around housing not being affordable and land is being lost to a lot of development. So there was a coalition of people that came together to tackle both of those things, which we're pretty excited about, that we're still going strong and doing this work in partnership with communities like you all. So we really are, I would say, first and foremost, a grant funder. So we make grants to groups who are going out and developing affordable housing for low and middle income people. And we also, on the conservation side, which is what we're going to focus on tonight, make grants to organizations like land conservation groups, recreational groups, other groups who are conserving land, whether that's purchasing land for trails or whether it's conservation easements on farmland. So we kind of run the whole gamut with this work. Okay, so what we're going to talk about tonight is Act 59, which is also called, this is a mouthful, the Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act. So this passed the legislature back in 2023, and this is really a bill that was focused on conserving land and conserving it with an eye towards supporting and enhancing biodiversity. So there's a lot of concern about loss of wildlife habitat and a lot of other environmental issues that are facing everywhere, the whole world, frankly. And this legislation is really meant to focus on how can we support Vermont maintaining an ecologically functional and connected landscape, and focuses on things like strengthening climate resilience. I know you all are hearing really terrible flooding in Ludlow and other places, so this plan does deal with trying to mitigate those kinds of effects. We also are working a lot through this work on supporting working farmland and forest land. That's another key piece of it. Recreational properties. And so the mission, or rather the vision of the act is really broad and encompasses all these things, but then it also kind of gets narrowed into like these two main goals of trying to conserve 30% of Vermont's land base by 2030. So we've got a couple more years to do that, and as was said at the beginning, we're at 27% right now, so we actually are pretty close to that. A lot of that's not surprising, I'm sure to you all. The National Forest land is a big chunk of that, a lot of federal and state holdings. And then the other side of this is trying to get to 50% by 2050, and this people in the room might be aware of as part of a national effort that's been happening the last couple of years. Vermont is one of probably 10 or 12 states where this kind of 30 by 30, 50 by 50 work is happening. Maine has a plan that they're putting together. California's another one, and there's several other states I'm not thinking of. But so that's kind of where this work came about from. Why this matters? So yeah, I think folks around the room, I'm sure many of you are conservation-oriented people. You know why this matters. Our land is under threat. We're seeing a lot of fragmentation of forest land. Vermont has lost roughly 25,000 acres of forest land in the last 20 years. We also see a lot of loss of farmland. We know that farmland is some of the easiest land to develop because it's cleared off, and it's often land that you can put septic on, and it's just easier to develop. And we've been losing about 100,000 acres of that farmland in the state in the last 2 decades. We've already talked about the climate impacts with flooding and last year's drought that affected a lot of farmers. And then also we've been losing land to residential development, and what we see is a lot of low density, think 10, 20 acres, a house in the middle of a field kind of thing. And while that is desirable in a lot of ways for people who live in houses and want to have their own little slice, 10 or 20 acres, it's also can lead to sprawling development, which is difficult for sustaining our wildlife and habitat. So the resource considerations, we like to talk about this piece of it because with all the talk right now, what's happening on a statewide level with a lot of concerns about rising property taxes, understandably, and just all the decisions that have to be made on how Vermont spends its money. And the same thing at a federal level. Things are very uncertain with federal grant funding. And so a question we get all the time is well, how are you guys going to do this? How are you going to pay for this? Where's the money coming from? Which are all wonderful questions. And you know what I think is important to know is that when this was all started in 2023, it was when there was the Inflation Reduction Act money coming from the feds, and there was a lot of conservation funding coming in. So that was sort of the backdrop. And now that is concerning because we don't have as much of that funding coming in. So we definitely are pragmatic about like, hey, we know there are some considerations around like how are we going to fund this. And what I can say is that people who are doing this work in the conservation community are very creative and wanting to look towards other sources like private funding, whether that's like philanthropic, charitable foundations, things like that, and just being more collaborative in our work and how we work with others to try and spread the money out and be realistic about what can happen. So where we are with Act 59. So it looks like we are in phase 2, and it makes it seem like we still have a third of the work left, but actually I'd say we're more at like, what'd you say, Phil, like 90%? Yeah. 90% there. We're in like the, yeah, exactly, the home stretch. So in 2024, we are focusing on the phase 1 of this work, which was a conservation inventory, and that, and all of this is dictated in the legislation. How, you know, the things that we had to do, and the first thing was doing this inventory. And so with that process, we had to figure out, okay, what's already been conserved? Because how do you know what you have to do if you don't know what's been mapped? And so that's really what that process was focused on, and I'll in a minute talk about what was learned during phase 1. And then also just understanding, we wanted to understand what kind of programs exist to conserve land, what are the different funding streams. It's just sort of an inventory of like all things related to conservation. Is how many acres have we protected, like the tools we currently use in the state. So that had a lot of public input as well. We did groups like this where people could weigh in on all questions related to that, the inventory stage. There were different working groups that focused on different things, like there was an agricultural working group, there was one that was focused on water resources, and then there was a lot of surveys done and just other ways to engage with people. So right now we're in phase 2, which is actually beginning to write the conservation plan. So if you did get one of those packets when you walked in, I apologize, I didn't know how many people would be here, so I didn't print quite enough, but that gives you an overview of the draft framework for the plan. And we'll talk more about what that is in a minute, but that's where we are right now, having this draft in place, and that's what we're interested in getting feedback from you all on, as well as just more broadly, like anything related to conservation that you want to talk about, we're here to listen to, knowing that maybe a lot of people weren't like combing through every word of the legislation before they came here or didn't read a 50-page plan. So, but at any rate, so we're working on developing the plan now. It needs to be delivered to the legislature by June 30th. So the feedback that we're getting, and I think Billy, you'll be talking a little bit more about that, but that's very committed to incorporating that feedback and from all the different ways that we're getting it. And then phase 3 is that if you have a good plan, the next step is actually implementing it. So that's going to be happening on 2026 on to 2050. So here's the data for people in the room that I'm a data nerd, so I love looking at this stuff. So this is what came out of the inventory phase, and it was done through geographic information systems mapping, and there's a lot of good resources that the state has on how they track this kind of information. And so what this found, punchline, and we've already mentioned this, is that the existing land that's been conserved, the existing conserved land is about 27% of the acreage. And I will say that permanent, how the legislation defines what's conserved, because this is a question we get a lot, is it must be deemed permanent. Well, what does that mean? It means that it has to have a permanent, like if a private landowner owns it, let's say, it has to have a conservation easement on it that's held by a land conservation organization that makes sure that that land can't be developed. Or it's a property that's owned by the state of Vermont, like a wildlife management area, let's say, something like that. So that's how it's defined. So the question we get a lot is, what about current use? Does that count? And that does not count in this data in the inventory, because of how the legislation was written, it was very clear that current use, because it's a great tool, we love current use because it keeps a lot of land from being developed. Landowners love it, it's good for the, relieving property taxes for landowners, but because somebody could pull that land out of current use tomorrow, pay the penalty, that's not, the state or the legislation did not, felt like that, it's not permanent because you can take it out of current use. So in terms of the categories, the high level here is that 8% of the state is these two top tiers, which is, I don't know if people can read this very well, but ecological reserve areas, biodiversity conservation areas. These are all things that the legislation defines very specifically. The way to think about those areas is those are more the higher level, like no touch, you can't do as much management in them. And these other categories, forest land, that includes working forest land that you can, cut. Agricultural land is obviously working farms. And so the biggest category combined, the biggest categories of forest land is 15.8%, agricultural and open lands about 3%, so the two of those is about 17% of the state falls into those what we call working lands, forest land and ag, and then 8% are these other more ecologically oriented areas, and then, that's kind of the overview. Okay, so a little bit more background on the conservation plan. I don't think I mentioned this, I was remiss, but VHCB in the law was charged with convening this process with the Agency of Natural Resources, so they're our partner in this, and providing a lot of the expertise around wildlife habitat parts of this plan, etc. The conservation plan has these specific elements that are highlighted here, things that we need to have in the plan or make sure that we recognize. So and I'm really happy about this, that there's a focus on agricultural land, conservation, working farms, historic properties, surface waters. So it's not just habitat, wildlife habitat, that's wonderful, but it's really, I think, encompassing the whole landscape of Vermont. That's not just one thing or the other. It's everything that's important. The plan also needs to utilize Vermont conservation design, and Bill's going to talk more about VCD and how that's a really cool scientific tool to figure out the best areas to conserve from a biological perspective, like what kinds of resources they have on them. The other piece of the plan that's going to have a lot of emphasis is on access and equitable access to land and what that means and what that looks like, and really that's a focus on historically marginalized groups, people of color, other low-income people, other people that have been historically marginalized, and how they can have better access to land for recreation or for farming or otherwise. And then last but not least, the plan really also needs to take into account the working lands enterprises. So we know that in order to keep forest land viable and agricultural land viable, it's a lot about the business aspects of that too. It's not just keeping the land base, but forest landowners need mills, to be able to process the wood and all of that. So the plan does tie into some more of those economic related strategies, which I think is really important. Okay, there's a lot of text on this slide, sorry. I'll just say as a side note, Vermont Adaptive in Rochester is a very cool project that we were able to give some funding to. I don't know if people really know about Vermont Adaptive. I know they do a lot of work up at Killington to get folks who are disabled onto skis, and work a lot with veterans groups, and they're doing a lot with mountain biking as well over in Rochester and conserve their property over there. So it's a cool project if you're not aware of it. So the plan itself, the thing I want to emphasize here from all this text is that really the goal is that we want to have a through line from the intent of the plan to actually getting to action. What you'll see in the meeting packets is the 3 objectives, which I'll talk about in a second, and then under that specific pathways to get there, and then actions and sub-actions. So it's really kind of a holistic plan to get to that point of actually being able to pull this off. And it really does tie into what was in the legislation, what we were required to put in the plan and have it based in reality of what we can actually do in the real world. So these three objectives are how the plan is framed. So we have objective 1, which Bill is going to talk about more, is on this Vermont conservation design, and it's really focused on how to maintain an ecologically functioning and connected landscape. Objective 2 is the support conservation in communities, and that's where protecting working forests and farmland fits into that bucket. Also recreation and equitable access is under that objective. And then last but not least is objective 3, strengthening conservation capacity. How the heck do we do this? How do we pay for it? Who's going to do it? And just sort of the nuts and bolts of that piece of it. And yes, and I'm wondering, maybe in terms of order of events, I should have had this sooner in the presentation, but in some of these talks that we've been having, we've heard from people in the community who are like, what about Act 250 or Act 181? And people, I'm sure people in the room or by show of hands, have people been following the Act 250 stuff that's been happening, Act 181? Okay, so quite a few, yeah. So that, while it's happening at the same time as this is not that. This is voluntary land conservation. People want to work with the land trust, with the Mount Holly Conservation Trust, and conserve their land. That's great, and that we encourage that. But this is not a regulatory process. This is just a planning process that we hope is going to incentivize more people doing voluntary land conservation. And in terms of the funding piece, it's going to get to the legislature to determine how this gets funded in the long run. I will say that the organization we work for, VHCB, does get funding annually from the legislature to support both the housing side of what we do and conservation. Usually, just in terms of numbers in an annual year, we're getting, I would say, about $6 or $7 million a year for grants for conservation work. And so that's grants to, like, if Mount Holly Conservation Trust applied for us because they're going to buy a piece of land and they're going to put trails on it, they could come to us for funding. So that's the work that the legislature has in funding, and we get a lot of match funding from federal sources too. The farm program we do is getting a lot of money from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's a wonderful partner and is matching our funds and helping farmland owners sell their development rights. So in terms of how this gets funded, again, we're figuring that out. I think it's going to take a lot of creativity and looking at sources outside of the state and federal, just knowing there's so much uncertainty and perhaps not political will to pay for that, and understandably, but I think there's a lot of people that are willing to work together to figure out a way forward with this. Okay, it's you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Cece.
A little specific.
So, I think where I want to start off is this is building off of a really unique history we have in this country of conservation, where there's a really democratic and public-oriented use for these lands. If you hunt, fish, recreate, or just enjoy nature, if you're a farmer, this conserved land network, if it's national parks all the way down to state forests or a private conservation land, this is all part of that effort where people love the land, they see themselves on the land, and this is kind of what we're looking and wanting to foster more of, is that democratic and widespread love and embrace for conservation values that support clean water, our livable communities, but also, like I said, the wonderful recreation and outdoor opportunities that we all really love and rely on in this state. And so part of this framework is Vermont conservation design, at least is what is driving forward the scientific basis for this work. And I think one thing that I want to touch on is that not necessarily, we're talking about 30 by 30 and 50 by 50, but a lot of this aspect is conserving the right acres. We want to do quality conservation work, and that's where VCD comes in. It's a scientific statewide basis framework for maintaining and restoring ecologically intact environment, and by that, or ecologically functioning environment, and by that I mean, you know, floodplains that are connected and that defray flooding impacts downtown. It's that you know, moose will be able to migrate from their summer to their winter habitats. So that we'll have a healthy population of game species or brook trout. So there's a lot baked into here in terms of what Vermont Conservation Design is focused on. And so it has multiple layers. It's showing where are the important riparian areas to conserve, where are the important interior forest blocks to conserve. And so those multiple data layers are kind of built into this work, and essentially it's really cool. You can interact with it. There's online tools that you can use. I think if you search A&R Natural Resources Atlas, or if you look at BioFinder, well, these layers are publicly available, and really interesting to see how this landscape interacts in terms of these conservation values to support that intact landscape that allows for plants and animals to move, disperse, migrate amidst land use change and climate change. And so it's really intended to support a full range of tools. If those tools are voluntary conservation easements, or if they are things like supporting efforts locally as it relates to zoning or stewardship of lands, it's all baked into Vermont Conservation Design. And the latest version or impetus or iteration rather of VCD is implementing VCD. And so this is the next step in showing that, you know, where do we want to really prioritize, so we're making sure that we're focusing on the most quality impact for conservation. And so this is one of the focuses is expanding ecological representation. So focusing on what we've conserved now and what maybe perhaps doesn't have like a higher percentage of conserved. So that's like if there's a certain forest type or natural community type that's like low represented in terms of it being conserved in easement or publicly owned. We want to focus on maybe diversifying where we're doing that work as it relates to specific habitats. Protecting connectivity corridors. This area especially is really valuable for wildlife moving out of the Adirondacks up and through to the Northeast Kingdom. So I'm sure all of you are very familiar with seeing wildlife corridors on your property or your neighbor's property. There's a lot of focus here on improving forest structure, so feedback and information on how can we steward our forests for these multiple uses. You know, we want to see a thriving timber economy, but we also want to see areas of older forests that have that disturbance regime where you have those big gnarly old trees that are falling and create a lot of nooks and crannies for wildlife and dense habitat values. So supporting aquatic systems, we want systems that support fisheries, systems that support clean water, support migratory birds, support farms, but also have those connected floodplains and wetlands that absorb floodwaters and defray the enormous cost of flood damage. And protecting rare and significant ecological features. Vermont is a host, I think it's especially dense with rare, threatened, and at-risk species, so that's something that we want to focus on here. And I think here, you know, we've done some really interesting projects, or at least conservation partners with VCB and the state. I think we've done a lot of work on the Okemo State Forest, Coolidge State Forest. Recently did a project in Wallingford with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to support the Otter Creek lowland wetland area up towards those montane habitats. So I'm sure that a lot of folks here have explored, wandered, or enjoyed some of those previous investments or conservation work supported by local efforts. And I think one of the coolest things about Vermont is that I've done a handful of these public meetings. I'm involved in my local conservation commission, so just always so impressed and really appreciate the groundswell of effort and interest in conservation in general. And I think it's what makes Vermont so special. And so connecting conservation with community. We want to look at access for viability and land-based enterprise with recreation that supports conservation and stewardship So all of that to say is that we want not only to have like those conservation features, but we also want and recognize how these lands support our rural economies. I know that I'm a big fan of my town forest in Northfield. I know it's a big economic driver for people to come into town, coming from all over the state to mountain bike, hike in the town forest, and they're spending money downtown and bringing people into the community. Also, we have done projects that have a unique model. This is a 1 acre community garden project that we did in Putney, and it's adjacent to an affordable housing project. And so having that aligned context of values is so valuable, supporting vibrant and healthy communities. So we want to have that holistic approach. And Stacy mentioned that we are the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. So we've done projects, or often when we do projects, we look at where's there a spot for housing? Can we facilitate housing within the scope of this project? And that's resulted in, recently did a project in Stowe, Morristown, with the Stowe Land Trust, and I think Down Street Housing, where there was 8 vacation rentals that were converted into mostly affordable housing units, and then the rest of the 160 acres is now publicly conserved and open for outdoor recreation. So it's those kinds of unique models that we're trying to foster, so that, like I said, we kind of have that holistic approach. And so aligning with other efforts, I'm sure some of you are aware of the statewide, the update to the SWAP, or Statewide Wildlife Action Plan, which is happening, facilitated or written by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's also the SCORP, or the Statewide Outdoor Recreation Plan, and other pieces. So we want to align with these local plans and boost them, and basically take in what's involved there, and also support and espouse those values in this plan here. And like Stacy mentioned, we're looking at centering conservation design as first objective. Second objective is conservation communities, and that's centered around having folks see themselves in the land and in these conservation projects. And then building that capacity for conservation, I think you could say, is fairly nested in all these plans, where we want to see more, increase the ability for local town-wide efforts or grassroots efforts like conservation commissions, or smaller groups to medium-sized groups, or anyway, to increase their capacity to do that work. And so in that draft plan you'll probably see some actions that relate to expanding or funding of conservation commissions, or working with municipalities to see how they can grow local efforts for conservation, because acting locally adds to really great landscape scale outcomes. And so next steps, like Stacy mentioned, we're kind of really close to the end of our phase 2. Right now we are accepting comments until March 31st for this first iteration of the draft actions and objectives of the plan, which is a huge document, and I'm sure all of you have not absorbed or digested that fully yet. But we're accepting comments. There's multiple ways to interact. I think there are QR codes floating around so that you can provide your individual comments, but I know that these comments here will be collated together and brought up to our team. But generally, the final version of the plan will have footnotes around where there was substantial or notable public feedback, and then there's also going to be a general glossary or appendix of summarizing the types and kinds of public feedback that we've gotten. So this comment period ends March 31st, pretty close, but then April we're going to be reviewing and implementing that public feedback into the next version of the draft, and then in May an updated draft plan is going to be released, and one more opportunity for feedback until June 30th, which is when the plan is going to be finalized and delivered delivered to the legislature. And so if you want to stay connected, VermontConservationPlan.com is the way to do that. Like I said, QR codes, and if there's any questions about how to get involved or lift your voice up and have us hear it, we'll be able to address that. But I think there's plenty of materials going around right now that'll support that. And so, I think just some food for thought before we start addressing just general questions about this presentation is like looking through the draft plan, what has jumped out at you, what excites you? Are there things that you may not like? Are there some things that you want to see in the plan but that you don't see so far? Are there some things that you want clarified or that you don't understand? And that given the realities of limited capacity and funding, where do you see the greatest need for more investment in conservation? And like, what resources does your community need for this work? So with that said, I think Stacey and I both really want to hear from you all. This is technically a listening session. So I think we're going to move into our questions part of the forum tonight. So thank you all so much and look forward to hearing more from you all.
Raise your hand. Yes.
I have a clarification, and it wasn't really clear. Do you consider federal land to be permanently
Yes.
conserved? Okay.
Yeah, so the National Forest is
And
part of that.
National Park,
That's a good chunk of it, yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Do you work with VAST?
Yes.
I'm new to this town in particular, but I grew up in East Wallingford. I spent 20 years in Hubbardton. I just moved here, but you're about 100 feet from, I would say, this winter VAST was incredible.
Great.
I dog sled as well, so
Nice.
I'm interested in if someone was to put their land through your conservation trust, are they allowed to develop it further? Are they allowed to, for instance, set up a forest farm? Are they allowed to, now that it's conserved, are they allowed to create a path out to protected land that is part of the state forest? Is that, I heard many positive things. I would like you to say something that's negative about because I want to see the full picture. I don't see a negative, but I know there must be something.
Well, I think generally with conservation easements, it can be pretty broad, and each one is generally very specifically tailored to that set of land and that specific scenario. And so when a landowner is looking to do a conservation easement, they need to find the right trust. There's a different organizations, land trusts that might have different niches, but if you were to, you asked me about what's a downside, and I would say one thing that folks really want to be careful about is when they are pursuing conservation easement is that they are forever, so that you want to be really have a lot of forethought in when you are negotiating or working with the easement drafters or the holders of that easement. Generally, when it comes to trails, I know when we do conserved lands or conservation easements on town forests, generally we look to have like a plan or a management plan around a vast trail, or make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of like the extent of that trail, where can it go in the future? Is it like a spur? Does it connect to a larger network? So I think a lot of careful thought needs to go into a conservation easement.
As well, I think Vermont's kind of unique because I believe within the past couple hundred years, I don't know the correct percentage, but I believe Vermont was almost like 70 to 80% farmland. So this state has changed drastically from that. And I see how we're conserving an area that is now very much changing. You talk about upkeep and maintaining, so are you, if for instance someone had a 300 acre, 500 acre, 1,000 acre farm that maybe is over half grown back in, is part of your project trying to create this open land again? Because there are a lot of species in Vermont that are essentially on the way out, because Vermont is no longer, even though we have mountains, no longer flat and open. So where are you going with that?
Well, I think I'll answer one part of the question, is that I think when it comes to like a private lands conservation project, we want to meet landowners where they are. Most of the times there are things like forestry management plans that might be in place as part of the conservation easement, which will give direction as to how the landowner wants to do forestry or timber management. But I think it differs a lot from where maybe a nonprofit or the state might purchase a set of land. For example, I know the Department of Fish and Wildlife likes to look at expanding, if they're looking to expand the Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area, they've done a few projects where the farm operation is marginal, an operator comes to them and says, we want to sell our land to you, it's not really working for us to, it's really wet soil. So then there are, that's an opportunity where Fish and Wildlife might work with like Ducks Unlimited to restore that to like a forested wetland. So I don't know if you want to touch on anything else.
Yeah, that was great. And I would also say with regards to the Vermont Conservation Plan, how it addresses questions like that, I think there is recognition that certain, like to your point, like we've lost so much open field, and with that like grassland habitat, like certain bird species like bobolinks are in major decline. So the plan itself does make some recommendations around trying to conserve more of that habitat type, or like getting landowners in touch with like certain organizations that might want to help with that. Like the Audubon Society gives farmers payments for delaying their haying, so that if they can get paid for that and skip their first cut or something like that, they can get paid for it. So stuff like that the plan talks about incentivizing. So yeah.
Point of order, Randy.
Yes.
I'd like to remind everybody that we do have the camera in the far corner of the room, and project your questions loud enough for the camera to be able to pick it up.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool.
Now, I think what I said earlier, they were looking to have possibly things that were related to the presentation, and then opening it up to just general comments and thoughts. And since there don't seem to be that
Andy,
many...
this gentleman had a question, if you can see him.
Oh, okay, Phil.
And during an elevator, and you have 30 seconds to tell me what I should take away from this.
Yeah, that is like, that's a
You're
really good
asking one of
question.
these people, or you're asking Bridget.
What should you take away from, this is great, this is how we needed to frame the whole thing. 'Cause
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge is there's so much here, it's so complicated. So I'll let you also speak up.
Yeah.
I would say, this is, I would say that Vermont has done an amazing job already conserving land, and kudos to everybody who's been doing that. I would also say that this is a really great opportunity for landowners who aren't aware or want to be doing more to plug in. And I'm hoping it's going to just galvanize more support for conservation, getting groups together that may not work together or not be aware of each other as much. So I'm just hoping it kind of elevates awareness around conservation and results in more conservation. Knowing that it's still a lofty goal, like we're 27% there, but we still have 190,000 acres to go, which to get there in 3 or 4 years would be vastly exceeding anything we've done so far. So I think it might take us longer, but I think like all the education outreach part of this, like this, is really cool. Like being able to like meet with people and talk about why you think this is important and how it supports community. I think it's great.
Yeah. I think, putting it really quickly, I would say, Vermont's landscape is such an important part of our way of life and identity, and that part of that is due to the conservation that's been done already. And this effort the goal of it is to see how we can increase the pace, do a better, higher quality job of conservation moving forward, and have an even more inclusive opportunity for folks to voice their opinions on how it should move forward.
Any thoughts on the answer? Was that good?
That was good.
Yes.
It was a little more than 30 seconds, but
Yeah.
Try to trim it down.
Doug, behind you. Behind you.
No, go ahead. No, you go.
No, you go. So, you kind of started to introduce an idea that I've been thinking of with the 30% and then in 2050, 50%. And you've already told us, I already forgot, the number of acres that means.
About 190,000 to get to the first.
So I was reading a draft online, but it wasn't this draft. Doesn't matter. But it did mention, and I'm interested in, where are those acres? Like, I don't think every town is the same, that we're all at 27%, obviously. So Are those acres identified, kind of where in the state they are, and will that become
Yeah.
kind of more public and more kind of front burner?
Do you want to take that? Because you're
Yeah.
involved with more of those conversations.
Yeah, so that's where the newest iteration of Vermont Conservation Design comes in. It really did a great job of identifying where those gaps in conservation are. And while that basically identified those areas, it's up to the plan to say, how can we foster more conservation or prioritize conservation in those places? So we've identified those gaps, and now it's our chance to look at how we can best foster those outcomes. The challenge is that these are all opportunistic transactions with willing landowners, so it's hard to say, you know, we are only gonna say target these X, Y, and Z opportunities, but at least we have a framework and we can work towards identifying and prioritizing those gaps and doing more work there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really stating the obvious, but, you know, this great goal, 30 by 30, awesome,
Yeah.
behind it all the way,
Yeah.
came out in 2023 from the legislature,
Yeah.
but obviously, I mean, you know, we could use some funding, some state
Yeah.
support to
Yeah.
help pull this objective
Yeah.
off. And so, to me, that's a glaring hole.
Yeah.
And of course, we all know how challenged we are fiscally in the state, for sure, already. But
Yeah.
I know that, you know, for example, this Conservation Trust could do even more good work than they're
Yeah.
doing now
Yeah.
with funding. So
Yeah.
that's a big one.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so I guess my message to you to take back, again, you've already thought of this, you know this, but, you know, if we want this to happen, we need some fiscal support.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I agree completely. I think the other thing though that is good is even if the legislature says, hey, we have to just keep funding HCB at its base, whatever, we can still do a lot of great work that's targeted towards this. I mean, I think if nothing, I'm really hopeful that we're gonna get more than just the baseline, or that not us specifically, but this initiative I'm hoping is going to be funded at a greater level. But even if it weren't, I think what's a positive of this is it's really giving us a framework, all of us in the conservation community, to really be more strategic and be proactive, because I think there's been a tendency for us, our organization, and a lot of others, where you tend to sort of be more reactive, like, oh, the farm went up for sale, we got to do something about it. I think it's kind of human nature. So I think this is really great, and that it's like being able to zoom out and look at those like gaps and areas where we really want to be more strategic.
I just want to add on to that comment is a lot of our work is supported by federal or private philanthropy. So federal sources of private philanthropy. So that is also a big piece of this, is that if there were a time where, you know, if there are organizations applying for federal grants, they can say that our work aligns with this plan in this way and all this other work. So this is also a part to leverage more federal funding and private resources for conservation too.
Yeah.
I've heard that the Vermont Land Trust is getting a little more picky as far as accepting easements and that type of thing, and the conditions of accepting easements and all that. Do you see any blockage ahead as far as organizations that are going to hold these easements and manage these easements? Or are there all kinds of opportunities and that's not a
I think it's
problem?
honestly the opposite. I think that in VLT, Vermont Land Trust has been a part of these conversations. They have representation on the technical advisory committee, which helps advise the development of this plan. Because we know we need to do so much and do things in different ways to meet this lofty goal. I think there's been a real interest, a growing interest in like, hey, let's think about smaller parcels. Like, why are we limiting ourselves at must be 100 acres or more? So I think that honestly it might be the opposite of like an interest in doing more, and it might be smaller organizations. So like leaning into like groups of the size of this land trust and Windmill Hill Pinnacle Association and Wyndham County, stuff like that. So I actually see it differently. I don't know if you agree.
That was a great, yeah.
That's something.
So the Green Mountain Club has initiated conservation of the entire Long Trail corridor, which is 500 feet on either side, and working to conserve that entire corridor and the side trails.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. I think statewide trails are one thing that are important to keep focused on.
Mm-hmm.
And that has pointed up an issue with looking at the lands that are in the corridor within this area, that the real ownership of those lands would end up being national forest. However, there's an issue right now, and with potential national forest ownership.
Yeah.
And that's something, so a lot of this area is within the proclamation boundary of the national forest.
Yeah.
And so the national forest should really be a significant player in this project, because a lot of the lands abut the national forest and could be managed by the national forest. And, you know, the federal government theoretically should have plenty of money for land conservation and acquisition.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna go back to the question about small land trusts, because
Yeah.
our experience has been around here, and we actually tried to get our land conserved, and
Yeah.
VLT had no interest in it,
Yeah.
or they need to charge a significant amount of money,
Yeah.
upwards of like $25,000, in order for the landowner to donate their property. And so I think support for small land trusts that can sort of fit in the gaps
Yeah.
of what VLT can't do,
Yeah.
or doesn't, isn't able to do, would be really helpful.
I so appreciate that comment, and it's something that we at VHCB are really interested in supporting. We've had a lot of conversations with some of the smaller land trusts about providing some more organizational capacity, like one, I won't name names, but one group that has a part-time executive director that we're hoping that with some funds from us over a period of years, if they match with philanthropic money, we can give them up to a full-time executive director to try and, fill that gap, as you said. I think the other thing that we're doing that partners are really excited about is we have a program now that helps fund project costs for land trusts. So like Vermont Land Trust, if they have someone like, in your situation, a landowner wants to donate a conservation easement, but they don't have the funding to cover those costs, they can come to us and seek project costs up to a certain amount of money, because that is the same thing we heard from them, is like, we really want to work with these folks, but they have a certain cost of doing business because they have to pay for a land survey and staff time and the stewardship endowment for the property. So it's pretty significant, like $40,000 to $50,000 per project often in costs. So that's the kind of thing that we can help bridge a gap.
And I assume priority is given to those parcels that fit within Vermont Conservation Design.
We need to update our policy, but yeah, I mean, we're talking about updating policies to align with this plan once it's done, yeah.
Just to stay on the same subject,
Yeah.
the challenge, well, what could be a challenge is when you talk about smaller land trusts, is the goal is to have this land permanent in conservation, but a small land trust may disappear.
Yeah.
I mean, if all good intention that it's created, but is it going to be managed permanently? Is it going to have sustainability? Or is it going to just disappear up the woodwork and then nobody's protecting it? So I don't know that the answer is a bunch of small little tiny land trusts that are well-intentioned and might be initially well-funded, but then there's nothing, it's like small everything. It's going to continue.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, that's a great concern, and I think when it comes to if it's either VHCB supporting funding for like a smaller organization, or if a smaller organization wants to hold easements in general, there are general like organizational strength criteria that needs to be met. Most land trusts are accredited through the Land Trust Alliance, which sets forth a handful of pretty significant standards of organizational strength, if you will, to be able to get to that level of holding easements. And VCB does the same thing. We're not going to co-hold or fund a project with an organization that we're not fully confident in their viability. And so there have been instances when smaller land trusts in the past have, perhaps maybe lost their stuff. A lot of times when that happens, generally those easements are transferred to a different easement holding entity or merged into a different land.
And if I could add on, you brought up something I didn't mention though. If VHCB provides conservation funding, we are typically also a co-holder of that conservation easement, so we're a backup in that case. If that small land trust doesn't exist anymore, we're hoping we're still going to be around. Yeah.
Bridget, you got a question?
Are you, yes, thank you. Are you disclosing where the priority areas are right now?
Well, Vermont Conservation Design is developed by the Agency of Natural Resources and is public. So that's I would say the most, that's a really strong framework that we work off of. We also, when we're presenting projects to our board, we'll reference things like the statewide wildlife action plan and other regional references or resources for conservation.
I will say it's how VCD defines those priority areas. It's what they call biophysical regions, and I think that there's a poster in the back that kind of lays that out maybe. But broad regional areas based on the geology, and it's broken into 5 or 6 different categories.
I think so. Yeah.
So it's not like a parcel by parcel, property level analysis. I don't know if that's what you were wondering, but it definitely within that, I think the VCD talks about how a lot of conservation, of course, has happened along the spine of the Greens, which we all know where the National Forest is, and up in the Northeast Kingdom, a lot of land has been conserved. But then there's other areas that are less targeted, the central, where we are up in Montpelier area, central Vermont, I think is within one of the lesser known areas, lesser conserved.
But Vermont Conservation Design is only one of the elements. That's not the main,
That's for the first objective,
ecological,
yeah.
but there's other, because I think consideration of community desires is
Yes.
really important.
Can you say more about
Well,
that?
we just did a community values mapping, and there are areas that came up in 3-4 different topic areas as being significant to the community on the maps. And so I would be thinking that those areas would be really important for the community to be thinking about conserving.
Yeah, and that definitely fits into the plan and into the second objective, which is focused on community, that community aspect, what's important within individual communities, and I think a lot of the farm projects often fall into that, because there's usually a connection, a really strong connection to community with those. That's a good point.
Often it seems as though select boards get very nervous when you start talking about conservation of land. For at least 2 reasons. One is I think they're afraid that the land that might be conserved would otherwise be good housing opportunities. And they're not necessarily talking about the ski house on top of the mountain with 50 acres, but talking about an area that could be reasonably subdivided, and you put a couple of dozen houses in a small area. I think a second concern that select boards sometimes have is that, as I understand right now, if land goes into current use, the state makes up the difference in taxes. Whereas if land has an easement on it, it should, at least in theory, be valued at the level of considering the easement.
Right.
And the town then will lose property tax revenue because the state will not make it up.
Right.
Is that right? And I'd be interested in your comments on those thoughts.
Yeah, the tax questions are really important, and I understand why they were on the minds of everybody right now. Yeah, I mean, you're right on the current use, how that, difference gets made up with funding from the state. In terms of a conservation easement that's held by a private, or on a private property, it really varies by town how they appraise those or assess those properties. You're right that in theory, if you stripped away the development rights, people should not be being taxed at the higher rate. But what I've observed is like landowners really have to go advocate for those changes at their local level. A lot of times they don't. Like, in other words, like, I don't think you can consistently say that conservation easements are dinging the tax rolls, because I think it really depends. Like, I know in the case of, because I used to work at a land trust, if we owned property, we would pay taxes. We would not ask for a tax rebate, or not rebate, but we would be paying at least something in lieu of taxes, often the full amount, just because of wanting to do our fair share. But every conservation group is different, and I do understand the concerns. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think you did a great job answering that, and I think one thing that comes to mind is that the Trust for Public Land, which is a nationwide conservation organization, did an assessment or a return on investment assessment on conservation, and showed that for every dollar spent on conservation yields a $9 economic benefit as it relates to if it's direct involvement in your town by people recreating, or if it is supporting lowering costs of natural disasters, everything kind of wrapped up. So conservation, especially in Vermont, does bring a lot of economic value to a town. I'm sorry, you had to do the first part of your question.
The first, right, about
Housing.
housing, right. If I own land that could be subdivided for housing, but I decide I want to donate a conservation easement, I mean, there's nothing that prevents me from doing that, as I understand, and though it might make the select board and other people in town unhappy.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, as it turns to projects that come to VHCB for funding, that lens of housing is something our board is acutely aware of. So we're always going to be analyzing and looking at if there is an opportunity for affordable housing in that area, or just housing in general. So we're always weighing that value, and most of our conservation projects do receive input from the local town and select board. So those values are always weighed.
Yeah, and I'll say that, if there was strong opposition from a town, I can't remember that we've had strong opposition recently on the project, but I'm sure in our past we have.
Yeah.
And I think that our board would really closely look at that, and we want to fund this, especially if it's like the property's right in town, on town water and sewer, and it's like an ideal place for development. That's something that we would really be hesitant about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any questions and comments actually will filter up, I'm sure, the powers that be, as it's shared with the state, and also people get a chance to maybe feed off of the ideas that other people have, which is a good symbiosis to have. So anything else you want to keep coming? Yes?
Phoebe Tucker, Ludlow. I just had a couple comments around, I love the equity considerations. I think that feels like, while innovative in conversation, actually like a long-standing thing that we need to be addressing. So really appreciate that. And then I've been looking over the actions to expand place-based education and outreach piece of things. And I know there's a lot of talk about funding and that being like a really important piece of things, but then just thinking about like, okay, what are different organizations and places that you're looking to connect with, of like, even if it gets funded at its like very lowest level, like that there's still a lot that people can learn about individually and in their communities to be able to like take one or two steps on their own properties or spaces that they collectively steward to do. So curious if you have some of those like communities or other organizations in mind that you're thinking about partnering with, and just kind of like furthering these education efforts.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I'm excited that education outreach moved into this plan, because I do think that is maybe sometimes underrepresented in plans like this, and such a crucial tool. One group that comes to mind that I know there's a lot of interest in working more with is the Vermont Community Garden Network, if you've heard of them. And so they, and especially because they do a lot with affordable housing developments as well, where they're trying to get gardens started and those housing units as well, so they have that cool dual mission going for them. But I think there's a lot of desire to see smaller plots of land like that being used for gardening. They're very underutilized. And I'm trying to think of other educational groups that you would sort of elevate.
Yeah, VCE, Vermont Center for Eco Studies, I think is one that does a lot of great work that could perhaps receive funding through some of these channels. But I think generally having that language in the plan is hopefully going to like foster a more targeted and outcomes on the ground. So I don't think we might identify certain organizations in the plan, but I think based on feedback, although it might be fairly broad, but it is a priority.
I'm sure you know this, Vermont Covers does a lot of work with landowners, and I'm interested in the discussion about Vermont Audubon working with farmers about paying their fields. I'd like to see them working with just landowners who have open meadowlands on good management of those meadowlands rather than just mowing, using gas mowing. What can be done to keep the lands open with maybe not quite so much mowing and more looking at the wildlife.
Agreed, and they may have programming existing for that. I'm really familiar with delayed mowing because I used to do a lot of work with farmers, but I don't know if you know if there are other programs that exist with Audubon. It's a great idea if there isn't.
I don't know off the top of my head specifically about Audubon, but I know something that like a lot of our partners are interested in. You said like, using gas to mow. There's been a big emphasis on like regenerative agriculture and what that could mean, alternative ways to keep a meadow as open habitat if that's through certain like livestock raising regimes. So can't answer that specifically, but I know that there's a lot of folks thinking of those exact same ideas.
There's an Audubon and maple sugaring organization. I keep seeing, I don't know, I just saw it again in the news. There's a farm, I think it's in Leicester, but
They do
I
like
don't know
a
much about it.
bird-friendly maple program. Yeah.
Well, it's like tree species management of a sugar lot.
Exactly. Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yes, is the Vermont Conservation design, is it possible to zoom in on the larger Killington, Okemo area, since
Yeah.
collectively probably know the most about that?
Yeah, it's super interactive. You can zoom in and there's multiple layers that you can add or leave off. Definitely recommend you get in there and play around. You can see if there's layers or like areas of rare, threatened or endangered species. There's ways to see if it's like an important riparian road crossing or wildlife road crossing. So yeah, there's a lot to interact with and you can zoom in to the parcel level.
Thank you.
Excuse us, we have to go do our own plan. We're on the Shrewsbury Planning Commission.
Thank you for coming.
So that raised an interesting question of the Killington, Okemo sort of area, because we are losing a lot of our open space to second or third homes, and they get used maybe 10 weekends a year, and yet it locks up a lot of the property and reduces the availability of affordable land for locals. And so, in a lot of ways, I feel like we should be arguing that the focus should be on these areas that are under such threat and pressure right now, as opposed to areas that have a lot of open land, but also don't have a lot of pressure. I think that's a real issue, and every parcel of land that comes up for sale in Mount Holly gets grabbed up very quickly if it's affordable. And oftentimes whatever property is on it is removed and larger homes are put up that are
are second homeowners. And so I don't know if there's a priority for housing that would be for people that are living there more than 6 months of the year or whatever. I mean, there ought to be some rules that would be legal that could help in this matter, because housing is a real issue here.
Yeah, no, absolutely, that's a really good point. I mean, this plan is interesting in that it doesn't, I mean, yes, it talks about what we should be conserving and from the perspective of the scientific side of it to the community side of it, but it doesn't explicitly talk about housing, which is interesting.
Well, our areas under pressure.
Yeah.
I do know that our existing conservation policies do account for threat as a priority for conservation.
Yeah.
So if there is you can probably see it on a map if there's a parcel and all next to it are spaghetti lots or pieces that have been chopped up and subdivided, that's a huge priority for us to pursue conservation on. And a big thing about fragmentation is, when you break up that landscape that might be, mostly forested with a house and a meadow, what happens are like edge effects where you're basically making room for general species to kind of inhabit, where maybe could be bluebird habitat, but then you have more European starlings, which are an invasive or naturalized species. And then you might have more dogs running around, which would maybe keep the moose on their feet more than they need to be. So we're all kind of keeping that habitat fragmentation and threat currently, and will probably persist as a huge priority for us.
One of the things we find is that the spaghetti lots, where it was 10-acre minimums, the whole back part is generally not used and often on steep slopes, and that ends up protecting as much as the ones that are larger tracts.
That's a good point.
I'm sure another hand or two will come up, but I just wanted to point out that before people leave, you have information boards in the back of the room, as well as the two in the front. And on the screen there, if you leave that up, you've got your QR code, or whatever they call it, and as well as contact information for you guys. So, it's a chance before everybody heads out of the door to talk with each other, to talk with your presenters here, and maybe get a couple slices of pizza to eat on the way home. Any other comments or questions or concerns? Yes?
I've got a quick one. I don't know if it's a question or just a comment, but I'm looking at your title there. It's Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. Conservation to me is keeping things open, protecting what's there. Housing is, you showed a picture of a farm, and I think it was in Paulette, that you had, there's low-income housing going up. That's behind that. I guess
Putney,
Putney, that was it. That's the thing that kind of scares me. I mean, if I have 1,000 acres and I give it to you folks, to keep it, to conserve it, to protect it, and then, I go away for a year and I come back and there's 15 houses on there, low-income housing, I'm gonna have a problem with that. And it's kind of like, are there things in place that kind of protects?
Yes.
There is.
So that particular example was a subset of the type of work we do where it makes sense to have some housing on it, and it isn't.
Thinking of downtown.
And it's exactly, and it, yes, in town area. The vast majority of the projects that we work with conservation groups like Vermont Land Trust to do are like 200-acre farm, let's say, that has a conservation easement on it. So that's a permanent deed restriction that is not going to allow what you're concerned about to happen. Like, you can't just subdivide that into a bunch of little house lots and develop it. Like, it's ironclad, like it's something that gets filed with the Register of Deeds, and every owner that owns that land from now until the end of time has to follow the terms of that. And we as the co-holder of that easement, and let's say it's with the Vermont Land Trust, we are the stewards of that property, meaning that on an annual basis, someone's going out, checking the land, making sure that people who own the land are not doing anything that's in violation of that conservation easement. So it's a really strong tool, and you know, that's would prevent the kind of situation you're talking about. And if anything were to happen, there are legal grounds to challenge it. Like if you came out and suddenly there's a mansion, a big mansion in the field, you would be like, okay, we're gonna do something about that, whether that's taking someone to court or resolving it in some other way. So.
In that situation, where you were the person, you know, negotiating and signing on the easement, you would be able to see everything that's in there. And the biggest thing with most conservation easement is limitations or removal of development potential. So that's like the biggest part of an easement. And when we've done those dual type projects, there's one we did in Walcott with the community forest, and we conserved 700 acres, but 1 acre was completely subdivided out, so not subject to the easement, and conveyed to Habitat for Humanity. So while it is the Housing Conservation Board, we do this work in concert, but a lot of times those pieces are separate, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Steve?
Yeah, and just to kind of build on that one a little bit, my understanding is if I had 200 acres, that I have the right to say, I'm going to conserve this 100 acres, I'm going to save this piece over here for my kids for a building lot, I'm going to save this piece over here because it goes with the house. Am I correct?
Yeah, technically you would work with the...
And that's the agreement made up front as part of the conservation agreement, so that what gets given for conservation is clear,
Permanent
not the
clear.
whole property.
Right. It's a negotiation between the landowner and the land trust, but yeah, because these are voluntary transactions, yeah, you get to say, hey, I want to do 100 acres with the land trust, and I want the other 100 acres to have no restrictions on it. That happens a lot. In fact, we encourage people to keep some land out because, like, we want, you know, to have flexibility, because not every, you know, things change over time. You may end up wanting to do something different with the property, so it's always good to keep some land out.
Oh.
One of the things that I've noticed where I live, a lot of houses that were bought, single families, have been snapped up and turned into rental properties. And if these people would see the number of people that show up for that rental property over a weekend, it'll be a 2-bedroom house, and there'll be 6 cars there. And there are about, in the last year, there have been 4 more than there, you know, they just keep, happens, you know, a lot. And it's, you know, it's no wonder people don't find housing because they get snapped up and turned into these rental places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big pressure. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest drivers of the housing crisis that we're in right now is this, you know, effectively Airbnb or VRBO are new ways to commodify housing, essentially. And so we're kind of reeling with this new situation.
Any other thoughts, questions? What I'd like to do is see if any of our Conservation Trust people want to say anything at the end.
Well, I thank you all for coming. What a great turnout. We are one of those tiny little conservation organizations that is all volunteer. We've been in business for 21 years now, and we've saved over 3,000 acres in Mount Holly, worked with the state the last few times on getting more land into a state wildlife management area and state forest. And that's been very successful. We take easements and then sell that land or give that land to other organizations that will protect those easements. So in the past, we had worked with Vermont Land Trust a lot. They are now really focused on farmland and on larger tracts. And so it's been difficult lately to find other organizations that are in the business of holding those easements long term. So we're now looking at, you know, is there a way for the smaller land trusts to get the capacity to hold the easements and have backup capacity for monitoring those. Monitoring the easements can become very onerous. We're wondering, you know, we're exploring those issues. Would all the folks who are on the Mount Holly Conservation Trust raise your hands so people know that which neighbors are? Yeah. We have a couple more that weren't able to be here tonight, so there's 8 of us all together. If you're interested in helping out, we're always looking for new members. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah,
Thank you for.
Thank you.